The costumes, the hair. There's only one ABBA. And after decades of going their own way, the Swedish supergroup is back.
There is a moment in every artist's life when the performance ends and the truth begins. For Benny Andersson, that moment has arrived at 78 years old. The man who sat quietly behind keyboards while the world screamed for ABBA is finally speaking with an honesty that he never allowed himself before. And what he is saying is reshaping everything fans believe they understood about one of the greatest pop acts in human history. This is not a story about gossip or scandal. This is the story of a deeply private man, a musical genius, and the hidden emotional cost of building something the entire world fell in love with. Most people who grew up listening to ABBA pictured a group of four glamorous Swedes living a charmed musical fairy tale. The matching outfits, the catchy melodies, the sold-out arenas. From the outside, ABBA looked like pure joy packaged into 3-minute songs. But Benny Andersson, the composer and musical architect behind that sound, has spent decades carrying a very different version of that story inside him. Now, in his late 70s, he is finally letting pieces of it surface. Not through dramatic headlines or tell-all memoirs, but through quiet, thoughtful conversations where the weight of his words says more than any press release ever could. Benny was born in Stockholm in 1946 into a family where music was not a hobby but a way of life. His father and grandfather both played accordion, and from an early age, Benny absorbed music the way other children absorb sunlight. He was not trained in the conventional sense, not shaped by years of conservatory instruction, but rather by listening, feeling, and experimenting. He taught himself to find emotional meaning in chord progressions before he even had the vocabulary to describe what he was doing. That self-taught instinct, raw and deeply personal, became the invisible foundation beneath every ABBA song that would later move millions of people to tears on dance floors around the world. Long before ABBA existed, Benny had already been shaping Swedish pop music with a band called the Hep Stars, where he developed a reputation not just as a keyboard player, but as a songwriter who understood tension and release in a way that felt almost architectural. When he and Björn Ulvaeus began collaborating in the late 1960s, something clicked between them that went beyond musical compatibility. Björn had a gift for narrative and language. Benny had a gift for emotional sound. Together, they began constructing songs that felt deceptively simple on the surface, but carried genuine weight underneath. That partnership, built on complementary instincts rather than identical visions, became the engine that would eventually power ABBA into the cultural stratosphere. What Benny has spoken about in recent years, with increasing candor, is how much of himself he poured into that music without anyone fully realizing it. When people listened to an ABBA song, they heard Agnetha or Frida. They saw two extraordinary voices delivering the emotion. But the emotion itself, the harmonic choices that made a song feel joyful and melancholy at the same time, the arrangements that gave a lyric more weight than the words alone could carry, all of that came from Benny's hands and from something much deeper than technical skill. He has described music as the language he used when ordinary language failed him. For a man who struggled to express complicated feelings in conversation, the piano became his most honest voice. This admission, which Benny has returned to in different ways over recent years, reframes the entire ABBA catalog in a fascinating light. Songs like The Winner Takes It All, widely regarded as one of the greatest pop songs ever recorded, carry a devastation that feels almost unbearable in its honesty. Listeners always credited that feeling to the performance, to Agnetha's voice cracking with controlled grief. But Benny constructed the emotional architecture of that song. He built the chords that made the performance possible. And he has since acknowledged that writing music was, for him, a way of processing experiences he could not confront directly. The songs were not just art. They were, in a very real sense, his emotional diary. This creates a poignant contradiction that Benny himself has begun to name openly. He was capable of expressing profound vulnerability through music, of creating songs that made strangers feel deeply understood, while simultaneously struggling to show up emotionally in his personal relationships. The same creative gift that produced timeless music also served as a kind of barrier. When life became complicated, When feelings became too tangled to manage, he retreated into composition. The studio was safe. The blank score paper was controllable. Real life, with its messy demands for presence and directness, was considerably harder. His relationship with Annie Fridlingstad, known to the world as Frida, lasted through the height of ABBA's fame and ended in 1981, around the same time the band itself was quietly dissolving. Benny has reflected on that relationship with a maturity and self-awareness that only time and distance can produce. He does not speak about it with bitterness or blame. What he has expressed is something more uncomfortable, a recognition that he was not fully present, not because he did not care, but because he had never really learned how to be. Music had always offered him a way around the harder work of emotional availability. Frida, by contrast, was someone who felt things openly and needed that same openness returned to her. The gap between those two ways of being in the world was real, and Benny has not tried to minimize it. What makes his reflections so compelling is their lack of self-pity. Benny does not present himself as a misunderstood victim of fame or circumstances. He presents himself with remarkable clarity as someone who made choices, some unconscious and some deliberate, that shaped his relationships and his legacy in ways he is still understanding. At 78, he speaks about his younger self with the compassion one might extend to a stranger, someone you can see clearly now that you are no longer inside the same story. The public image of ABBA always centered on its two female singers, and this was simply the reality of how the entertainment industry worked in the 1970s. Agnetha and Frida were visually compelling, vocally extraordinary, and personally fascinating to the public. Benny and Bjorn, standing behind their instruments, were categorized quickly and comfortably as the behind-the-scenes men, the capable craftsmen who built the machine. Benny has spoken honestly about how this framing affected him, not with rage, but with a quiet frustration that built over years. He was not chasing fame. He never wanted to be a poster on a teenager's wall. But there is a meaningful difference between choosing anonymity and having your contributions quietly minimized by an industry that did not know what to do with a man who preferred chord sheets to photo shoots. He wanted the music to be understood as music, not just as product. He wanted someone to notice that the sadness woven into even the most celebratory ABBA songs was intentional and meaningful. That the reason Dancing Queen feels like both a peak and a farewell simultaneously is because Benny constructed it that way. That the reason their ballads hit so hard is because he refused to let them be simply pretty. He added dissonance, tension, and unexpected harmonic turns that kept listeners emotionally off balance in the most beautiful way. These were not accidents. They were decisions made by someone who understood music as emotional language, not just entertainment. By the early 1980s, ABBA was coming apart not through any single catastrophic event, but through the slow accumulation of exhaustion. Both couples within the group had separated. The personal entanglements that had always complicated the professional relationships were becoming impossible to navigate. The creative energy that had felt limitless in the mid-70s was running thin. Benny has described this period not as a dramatic collapse, but as a gradual fading, like a fire that goes out not because someone throws water on it, but simply because the wood runs out. There was no final fight, no tearful farewell meeting. There was just a quiet, collective understanding that whatever had made ABBA possible was no longer present in the same form. What followed for Benny was a period of reinvention that the public largely did not witness. He threw himself into theater composition, collaborating on projects like Chess and later the Swedish musical Kristina, Fran de Vemela, which drew on deeply personal emotional territory rooted in Swedish history and human endurance. These works were not commercially calculated. They were artistically driven in a way that ABBA, for all its genius, sometimes could not afford to be when commercial pressures were constant. In writing for the theater, Benny found a freedom he had not experienced since his earliest days of sitting alone with a piano and following a melody wherever it wanted to go. He has also spoken about the strange experience of watching ABBA's legacy grow larger with every passing decade. The band stopped making music together in the early 80s, and yet their influence and their cultural presence only expanded. Mamma Mia, first the stage musical and then the films, introduced ABBA to generations who had not been alive during the original years of the band's activity. Benny watched this with a complicated mixture of pride and something harder to name. Pride because the music clearly still meant something real to people, and something else because the version of ABBA that the world was celebrating was necessarily simplified, the joyful surface, without the difficult interior. The decision to create new ABBA music, which resulted in the Voyage album released in 2021, was not taken lightly by any of the four members. Benny has described it as a process that required genuine emotional reckoning. Coming back to that creative space after 40 years meant confronting everything that had happened in that space before. The collaborations, the relationships, the endings. He and Bjorn had maintained their friendship and professional connection over the decades, which made the reunion possible in a way it might not otherwise have been. But Benny has acknowledged that recording new music as ABBA also meant sitting with a lot of unresolved history. At 78, what Benny seems most interested in is honesty, not the settling of scores or the rewriting of history, but a genuine accounting of what things actually were, beneath the glossy mythology that surrounded ABBA for so long. He has said in recent years that he spent too much of his life communicating through music rather than through direct human connection, and that while the music was real and meaningful, it was also sometimes a way of avoiding the harder conversations. He does not say this with regret exactly. He says it with the particular clarity that comes from having enough years behind you to see your own patterns without defensiveness. The legacy of ABBA, as Benny now understands it, is not the sequined costumes or the record-breaking sales figures or even the songs themselves, although the songs remain extraordinary. The legacy is something more intimate. It is a proof that four genuinely flawed and struggling human beings, using their talent and their pain and their complicated love for one another, created something that outlasted all of their personal difficulties. The music survived the heartbreak that partly produced it. The songs that were written through silence and distance and emotional avoidance turned out to connect more deeply with human experience than almost anything else in the history of popular music. That is the thing Benny Andersson has finally confirmed, not through a single dramatic revelation, but through years of honest reflection arriving at a quiet, profound truth. ABBA was never a fairy tale. It was something better and stranger and more real than that. It was a group of human beings who found in music a way to hold themselves together long enough to create something genuinely beautiful. And now, at the far end of a remarkable life, the man who built that sound is finally telling us what it actually cost. Not to diminish what was made, but to honor it properly. Because the truth, even when it is complicated, is always more interesting than the version we imagined.